Interactionists see gender quite differently. And this sort of leads a little bit into some ideas about postmodernism. But when we talk about gender at an interactional level, the the central thing you need to understand is to say that the interactionists, like the interactionist perspective on what gender is a little bit different. So if you listen to sort of the discussion and like you pay attention to it in listening to how I talk about functionalism, about conflict theory, and how it's written in your textbook, one of the things that you wind up with is this idea of like, oh, like gender is immutable. It is a trait of a person. It's something you like, oh, you're female, you're a woman forever, right? And that's a stable identity. And the interactionists sort of step back and go, no, not really. They argue that gender is something you do, not something you have. And this plays into a whole bunch of ideas about what we read around gender. Because if you remember, like the very beginning of this chapter, there's all this stuff about gender identity, right? And gender identity is not about what you do, it's about how you think of yourself. Except that when we interact with people on an everyday kind of basis, we proceed as if we know how they identify internally. And that's a conversation around like, okay, well, we have an idea that this person thinks of themselves as masculine and as male, and therefore we can expect A, B, and C out of them, or this person understands themselves as female, so you get C, B, and D, E, and F out of them, and that's fine. But from an interactionist perspective, there's sort of an emphasis on the fact that like we don't actually know anyone else's internal state. Often we don't know everything about our own internal states. So we can't talk about gender as something that you have. We have to talk about gender as something that you perform. That gender is not sort of like, the gender is not a thing, it's an action. And this is sort of a way, in a lot of ways, of highlighting all of the learning that goes into gender and how we understand gender around people. So thinking about all kinds of things that are associated with your gender that you have learned at some point in your life, but you never think about, or more for the most part, you don't think about now, right? I will be perfectly honest and say that no one should ever ask me to blow dry my own hair because I have no idea how to do it. I've never learned to do it well. That's sort of an action of doing gender that I fail at a lot. But I know I have a lot of students who will know how to blow dry their own hair, and they're like, oh yeah, no wait, I did have to learn how to do that. And it's not necessarily just like the appearance-based things. It's things like, how do you signal that you are interested in another person, right? If you are interested and you think someone is attractive and you would like them to come talk to you, or you would like to speak to them, how do you communicate that? How do you communicate competence? How do you walk? What ways are acceptable to sit? What ways are acceptable to ask for attention? All of those things, like when we talk about socialization and learning gender and gender socialization, we're not talking about like an easy sort of like, here's a 12-step like process to becoming whatever gender you are, like whatever gender you want to be today. It's not like that. When we're talking about gender as a performance, we're highlighting the thousands of pieces that go into that. The questions about, hey, wait a second, how much are you supposed to care about this thing? That's a performance of doing gender. So my husband is not in these videos, but he will sort of talk about having grown up as a musician. But in his professional career, he like learned that he had to pay a certain amount of attention to like professional sports because in his professional career he was expected to do that, and if he couldn't talk about whether or not this series of games was going well, at least in like very general terms, he was read as not performing gender appropriately, right? And like from his perspective, he's like, I really don't care. I don't want to watch this. I don't have any interest in being there, but I need to do this in order to be read appropriately in my job, in order to be read as masculine and not failing in some way. Absolutely goes back to all of our conversations about what does a leader look like. It's a conversation partially about like performing those roles and what those look like. Um, and this, like, we could talk about doing gender in like super minute detail in terms of when do you look someone in the eye, when do you turn your head, all that sort of stuff is part of this idea about doing gender. um, and there's a lot of conversation about from trans folk actually about how hard it is to learn the other set of norms, to be able to do the other gender in a way that is like convincing and authentic, so people read you the way that you want to be seen. That is a super sort of complicated piece of that, but like we do go down to that level. And I'm gonna sort of link this idea about gender as something you do in an interactionist perspective to postmodern ideas, which sort of are in the same way, right? Like gender in a postmodern sort of perspective, that like there's an idea of like, I don't know that gender's a real thing. It seems to just be like a set of conventions, right? That like, well, we sort of I have these ideas, but they're not fixed and they're not real in sort of meaningful ways. And this sort of, it moves to a conversation that takes a step back from sort of all of the stuff about whether gender roles are good, like whether like this particular behavior is good for women or bad for women or anything like that, and steps back and sort of says, hey, wait a minute, should that category be relevant? Right? This is the conversation about a post-gender society, about a society where like we just sort of decide that gender roles don't aren't relevant and we're not going to allow them to resonate with people, because if you think about it, there are lots of other traits that we could classify all kinds of things around, right? Like we could, I mean, there's a lot of like really random sort of genetic traits, like if you can roll your tongue in a circle or not, or if your earlobes are attached or like detached from your head, right? Like there are all kinds of like traits that are genetic in the same kind of way as like biological sexes, except we've decided that those are not socially relevant, right? Like we don't talk about the discrimination against people who can't roll their tongues in a circle. Like we don't, that's not a thing. We don't talk about it as being relevant. And so the postmodernist approach sort of questions the idea of gender on that level about, hey, wait a minute. Should we be sort of contributing to this at all? And what does it look like when people step outside of that? And asking that kind of more existential, more philosophical question about gender, about sexuality, about whether gender is a reflection of biology at all, or whether like all of those sorts of pieces. We could do a whole lot of really great discussions about that. It's just, it takes a long time to get into it all.